Hi, how are you doing? I'm going to give an introduction to the gastrointestinal tract, the gut, the GI tract, the alimentary canal. I've got a bit of a playlist of introductions to systems, and I'll probably add introductions to regions of the body, I guess, because those are two ways you can approach anatomy. But that means we're going to work our way from mouth to anus. We're going to follow the tube all the way through, mostly focus on the anatomy. We're always going to talk a little bit about function because structure and function are related. And we'll work our way along the tube and add on a bit of nervous system, a bit of blood supply at the end, all right? It's not going to be in massive detail because this is an introduction, so I'm going to leave things out, but you'll find I have plenty of other videos of far too much detail if you'd like more. So the gastrointestinal tract starts up here. It starts in the embryo as a very simple tube. It's one of the first shapes to form. It's a tube that runs through us. And in that respect, the inside of the tube is an external surface inside of us, which is an important idea medically, clinically, anatomically. And it has a number of layers. I mean, it has a mucosa on the inside, which does various things, but we can think of it as a muscular tube. There's the esophagus there. And two of the layers are muscle, and some of the muscle is running longitudinally along the length of the muscle, and some of the muscle is running in a circular fashion around the tube, and together those use peristalsis to push the contents, the stuff that you eat, along that tube, which is several meters in length, right? So peristalsis, the circular muscle will squeeze the contents of the tube, and then the longitudinal muscle can make it shorter, so it can push the things along the contents of the tube. And inside that external surface within us, we find many bacteria. And the bacteria are living in there and helping us with our digestive processes, because that's the purpose of the gastrointestinal tract, right? Is to eat food and drink and break that down to molecules and solubilize those molecules, and then take those molecules across the mucosa, so from that internal external surface across the cells and into the blood. And then once it's in the blood, it's in our body properly, and then we can make use of it, right? Food that is not digested, is not absorbed, continues through the GI tract and is excreted through the hole at the other end, the anal aperture, the anus, the anal opening. And also, waste products produced by the body get put into the gastrointestinal tract so that those get removed as well. The bile from the gallbladder is very green. We have components in there that are being excreted, and that's what actually gives feces their characteristic brown colour. I'm just taking some organs out so we can see the organs that we're interested in. Okay, so the start of the gastrointestinal tract is the oral cavity in there. Here's a half head, right? There's the oral cavity. In there we find teeth, we find a tongue, we find these muscles of mastication that move the jaw, and we find salivary glands. There's a salivary gland, and there are salivary glands under there. So digestion starts when we put food in our mouths. We start to break it down by chewing it. Saliva starts to enzymatically break it down. Saliva has a whole bunch of other jobs as well. The tongue moves things around the mouth to help with chewing, but taste and smell are both important in getting that food in the first place, in wanting to eat it and knowing that it's good to eat and that sort of thing. And then once the food has been broken down and we form a bolus, the tongue and these structures back here push the bolus of food to the back of the oral cavity towards the pharynx, and then swallowing occurs. So the trick here is that we have to put food and water and air through the same passageway, through the same tube, which can be a little bit risky. If some food gets stuck in the wrong place, you can't breathe. You kind of need to breathe, so then you need to get that food out. But ideally, food will then be passed into the pharynx and then down here. That there is the esophagus, the start of the esophagus. This is the airway, the larynx and the trachea. This is held open because we're breathing all the time. The esophagus is normally collapsed because we're not eating and drinking all the time. And when food gets pushed down here, the esophagus opens as that food gets pushed into it. Peristalsis begins, and the food and drink moves down the esophagus. The esophagus then runs through the neck. It's posterior to the airway, and it's very posterior. It's up against the vertebral bodies back there. So the esophagus is a tube connecting the oral cavity with the stomach. Here's the stomach here. And it does not rely on gravity to get things to your stomach. You can eat in zero gravity in space. You can eat and drink upside down or lead down, probably. I don't recommend it, but it still works because the muscular tube pushes things along. And that's the structure for the whole tube, those layers of muscle doing that same sort of function. This here is the diaphragm. So the esophagus then passes through the thorax, because in the thorax we have organs of the circulatory system, the heart moves blood around the body, and organs of respiration, where we bring oxygen in and push CO2 out. We have the lungs on either side. So it's kind of jumping that gap. Whereas the abdomen, the abdominal cavity, in here is where we find most of the gastrointestinal tract, most of the organs of digestion. So the esophagus passes through the diaphragm. It has a special hole for it, and then here's the liver. Let's take the liver out so we can see a little bit more. Here's the stomach here. Now the stomach is a muscular bag. It's an expandable bag. You can store a whole meal in here. And again, it has those layers of muscle. In fact, it has layers of muscle running in different directions. And it has a very strong sphincter here at this end, the pyloric sphincter. It's a really thick muscle. And that keeps that end of the stomach tightly closed, so that in here, the stomach can churn all the food around that you've chewed up. More enzymes get added to the mix, and we have some mechanical digestion and some enzymatic digestion going on in the stomach. The famous thing about the stomach is that it produces acid. Now, the main purpose of that is that to break down proteins, the stomach secretes an inactivated, a safe form of pepsin, so a safe form of a proteinase, because, well, the body's made of protein. So if you weren't careful, you could produce enzymes that would break down your own body from the inside. It's going to be a bad thing to do. So this version of a proteinase, a protein enzyme, an enzyme that breaks down proteins to amino acids, a version is secreted with a safety on, and then with the hydrochloric acid, with the low pH, that enzyme becomes activated, and then it can get to work on the proteins that are within the stomach, as in the ones you've eaten, not the ones the stomach is made of. And the stomach is also lined with mucus to help protect it from that. The stomach then squeezes, allows a little bit of chyme, just a tiny amount of its contents, into the duodenum, just a little bit at a time. It doesn't all go through at once. And then from the stomach, the contents, the chyme, gets passed into the duodenum. The duodenum is the first part of the small bowel. Now it's hidden away here. Okay, the spleen's going to fall out, isn't it? If I take this out, so there's the duodenum there. That's where the stomach has passed its contents into the duodenum. When I turn this around, you can see that it forms this C shape here. So the duodenum is pretty well fixed to the posterior abdominal wall, which is why I've had to turn this around. And in that C shape, we find the pancreas. So there's the pancreas there. So the duodenum, its first part, is adapted to cope with the stomach acid. And it also receives secretions from the pancreas, so enzymes that are going to further aid digestion. And it also receives bile, that's the green tube there, from the liver and the gallbladder. The gallbladder is just kind of like a store. It's liver that makes the bile. And the bile contains waste products from the body, which are going to get excreted eventually. But it also emulsifies fats to aid in the digestion of lipids, right? The duodenum curves around, rises up a little bit. It's about 25 centimeters long. And then from this point on, it becomes the next part of the small intestine, which is what we're seeing over here, the jejunum. Now, it's the jejunum where I think it's safe to say most absorption of nutrients occurs. Inside the jejunum, we see massive modifications to maximize surface area. We see the plicae circularis, we see circular folds on the internal surface of the jejunum, giving more surface area, right? And then we see villi, finger-like projections from the wall, which actually gives it a very soft, velvety touch if you ever get the chance to stroke the inside of the jejunum. Sorry, too far. I teach anatomy. The villi give then more surface area, and then the cells that are on the surfaces of the villi have their own projections of cell membrane, which are microvilli. So there's just surface anatomy there's surface area plus surface area plus surface area. It's already wiggly, right? So this is wiggle, 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 wiggle. The jejunum is about 2.5 meters long, if you were to dissect this out and stretch it out. And it gradually becomes the ileum, which is also small intestine. So the small intestine has 3 parts: duodenum, jejunum, and then ileum. And the ileum is about 3 meters long. And it's slightly different, but it's still a site where lots of absorption of nutrients is happening. But we're seeing absorption of the bile salts, so a bit of recycling of materials here, the absorption of vitamin B12 and things like that. So as the stuff you're eating passes along the small intestine, most of it is getting digested and absorbed in the first part, duodenum, jejunum, and then ileum. And then the ileum here, this is the last part, it passes into the large bowel. This is the ileocecal valve, which ensures that the contents of the small bowel pass into the large bowel and not the other way. The cecum then is the start of the large bowel, the start of the large colon, the large intestine. And it's a blind ending pouch, and this is where we would find the appendix. Have you got an appendix? I can't remember. I bet you have, right? Oh, there it is. Big obvious one. There's the appendix there. The appendix is an outpouching from the cecum. It's an outpouching of bowel. In there is, it's essentially you've got the bacteria throughout the gut, right? So you've also got the bacteria of the gut in there. If somebody has a gastrointestinal illness and the contents of the bowels get flushed out with diarrhea and vomiting, the bacteria that aid digestion get flushed out as well. So the good gets chucked out with the bad, right? Recovering from that illness, supposedly there is then a collection of those good bacteria still within the appendix. They've survived that flushing out process. So you can repopulate the bacteria of your gut quicker from those bacteria that stayed in the appendix, right? Okay, large bowel is then sensibly named. So we have the cecum, and then we have the ascending colon. This is fixed in place. Whereas the small bowel has got a mesentery, which is a connective tissue. The peritoneum covers and lines all this. One of my first ever videos was about the peritoneum. I did it on a phone, recorded it on a phone, balanced up against some books. Go seek that one out if you want to know more. It's quite complex, but it means that the small bowel is attached to the posterior abdominal wall. That's how blood vessels and nerves get to it. But it can also move around, which is important when you're pushing things along through the inside of it, right? So the ascending colon doesn't have that. It's fixed in place. Over here, we have the liver. So where the angle changes, we call this the hepatic flexure or the right colic flexure. And then we have the transverse colon, which actually has a mesentery here, so it can move around. It often hangs down here. And then on this side, we have the spleen. So this angle change gets called the splenic flexure or the left colic flexure. And then we have the descending colon, which is also fixed in place. And then we start to make a bit of a wiggle. So that S shape, this wiggle here, is the sigmoid colon. And the sigmoid colon then continues as the rectum. And the rectum is the last part of the colon, well, the last part of the large bowel, and it descends through the pelvis to the anal canal. Now, the jobs of the large bowel are largely water resorption and salt resorption. So you get a lot of water from your food. You don't need to drink like 2 litres of water a day. That's just a made-up number. Everybody's different, and it depends how much you're... Anyway, you get most of your water through your food, or you certainly get a lot of water through your food. And the large bowel is resorbing that water. And it also absorbs a few nutrients, special nutrients, vitamins and that sort of thing. So you can imagine then that if the water is being resorbed, get taken away from the contents in here, the contents are being packed down, they're getting dried out, and the large bowel is forming feces. Those feces then get stored in the rectum, and the rectum has stretch receptors in its wall, and when it starts to get stretched, it lets you know that it would like to be emptied, please. The job of the anal canal is there are 4 mechanisms in there to stop it emptying when it's inconvenient or inappropriate to do so. So here we can see in the pelvis, there's the rectum becoming the anal canal. I got a whole video on fecal continence. Honestly, it's surprisingly interesting anatomy. If I take this apart, there's the rectum and there's the anal canal here. Like textbooks, this model is showing that this is open, but of course it's closed almost all the time. And what we see here is we see smooth muscle within the gut. So that autonomic muscle, that muscle you don't have any control over, those layers of muscle of the intestinal wall propelling things along, they make a sphincter, so they help close the anal aperture. And then we have skeletal muscle, because we're getting to the skin again here. And this skeletal muscle you have control over. So you have control over one sphincter, that's the one you can hold on to, but you don't have control over the other sphincter, that's like autonomically kept closed, and some other bits and bobs. And that is replicated up here in the esophagus. So when the esophagus begins, it is mostly made of skeletal muscle. You're aware of swallowing, you can do swallowing, you can choose to swallow. It's an autonomic series of events, but you're aware of it, right? But then as the food passes down the esophagus, the muscle down here is smooth muscle you're not aware of, not in control of, it's automatically controlled. So as we start near the skin, we have skeletal muscle and then it becomes smooth muscle. And then at this end, we have smooth muscle and then we start to see skeletal muscle getting involved as we get close to the skin again. How cool is that? Right. So there's a lot going on here, and I nodded towards some of the organs associated with the gastrointestinal tract, like the pancreas and like the liver. And all of this has to be managed and controlled and has to work together, right? And it's often said that the gastrointestinal tract has its own brain, the enteric nervous system. There are about 500 million neurons associated with just this. So there are a lot of regulating feedback loops. And if you disconnect it from the brain, it seems that it will just regulate and do its own thing. So there are nerves controlling all these processes, switching on glands and increasing blood flow and telling muscles to contract and glands to squeeze and that sort of thing. But there are also hormones. So there are hormone loops driving all of these processes, switching them on and off when food is in here and when it's passed through there and that sort of thing. And those hormones are associated with sensations that we are aware of, like hunger sometimes, right? But this is also connected to the brain and the spinal cord. And these are organs, so they're under autonomic control. Like I said, you're not really aware of this happening most of the time. You can't think about it or control it. So we see the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the nervous system tying into this. And we see visceral afferent fibers, that is sensory neurons, carrying information back to the brain. So this can be modulated at different levels, and hormones from elsewhere. The parasympathetic division of the nervous system is usually associated with rest and digest functions driving the gastrointestinal tract, and it's the vagus nerve that carries parasympathetic fibers down to this system. Sympathetic fibers come out of the spinal cord and also drive this. So they have effects on smooth muscle, on blood flow to different regions, because you don't have blood going at full whack to every part of your body at once. Your body sends blood to the regions that need blood at the times they need blood, right? So sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation help regulate the flow to the organs that need it. Yes, that's kind of the innervation, vagus, sympathetic, and then the sensory nerves find their way back through those same routes. I'm sure I've talked about them elsewhere. The other interesting thing is the blood supply. Did you notice the whacking great big artery next to the GI tract? So here's the heart. That's the aorta coming out of the left ventricle that is then going to send blood around pretty much the entire body. And the aorta, it's right next to the esophagus. So the aorta is sending branches to the GI tract straight away. And if we look inside the abdomen, we see that the aorta has 3 major anterior branches here. And those anterior branches, well, what's anterior of the aorta? It's the gastrointestinal tract and these associated organs. So we see the celiac trunk as the first branch. That appears just after the diaphragm. And the celiac trunk will supply blood to the stomach, the esophagus, half the duodenum. And then the second branch is the superior mesenteric artery, which will supply blood to the rest of the duodenum, the whole of the small bowel, ascending colon, most of the transverse colon. And then down here we have the inferior mesenteric artery, which will supply blood to the rest of the transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, upper part of the rectum. And what we're seeing here is, can you imagine how the embryo has a simple artery running down here? Can you imagine how there was a simple tube running down here? And that simple tube actually had a bit of a loop here, but it had those 3 branches supplying that tube. And as that tube got longer and folded and moved around, it took branches with it. But if you hear people referring to foregut, midgut and hindgut, which you often will in clinical medicine related to the gastrointestinal tract, these arteries define the foregut and the midgut and the hindgut. Those are embryological ideas, foregut, midgut and hindgut, but the arteries went with the structures that formed from those bits of tube. So if we're worried about the blood flow through the celiac trunk, we worry about the parts of the foregut. So we think esophagus, stomach, half the duodenum and so on, all right? So that is the anatomy of the gastrointestinal tract, the alimentary canal, the tube that runs through us, which is actually an external surface inside us that we pass external substances through, break them down to molecules, solubilize them and absorb them into our blood and make use of them. It follows a similar layout all the way through in terms of being layers of muscle and mucosa, but each part has a slightly different job. I mean, it's about, 7 meters long. It's a really long tube. That's an overview. It's always fun talking about a system as a whole. If you would like more information or more detail, I've made far too many videos about the anatomy of this sort of thing. If you're interested in that sort of thing, use YouTube's search function, use my name, put in whatever topic you're interested in. It'll show you if I've made a video about it, I hope. Google's quite good at search. Anyway, I hope that was useful. I really hope it was interesting. See you next week.